Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Bakhtar Institute podcast. My name is Reza Kasemi. The main objective of our podcast is to discuss the contemporary issues related to Afghanistan and raise awareness on human rights, peace, democracy, and education. Therefore, today we will be discussing the consequences of Taliban regime's ban of women from education and work in Afghanistan and the international community's response against it. Today, we have a special guest, Dr. Mirwais Balkhi, former Minister of Education of Afghanistan. Mr. Minister, it's a great pleasure to have you in our today's episode.
Thank you very much, Mr. Qasimi.
In our today's episode, Mr. Minister, we will be discussing the consequences of Taliban regime's ban of women from education and work and the international community's response against it. What are the reasons behind banning women from education? Why are they doing this to women of Afghanistan? Are the Taliban using women as hostages to get what they want from the international community, such as state recognition? Or there might be certain religious instructions against women that we are not aware of?
That's a crucial question when we talk about the main variable behind ban of women from education. I believe, first off, it's better to define who is Taliban. Then it would be very easy to understand the reasons behind ban of education. For me, Taliban is a socio-religious backward forces. So two parameters are important: society and religion, the understanding, the context, and the narratives that they have from the limited social geography that they raise up, and also from the religious readings that they believe for. That is why in the madrasas, in the areas that they got education, especially religious education, and also the customs that they were living with in those areas, both are unfortunately against the status of, especially the ongoing status of women in Afghanistan, and also in the border areas on the both sides of the Duran line. That is why the reasons now is not state recognition or a political strategy. The reason is, first of all, they know that they need legitimacy for their survival among the militant Taliban. Now, if they are fighting 20 years, or I can say after 1994, when they were fighting against the common ground, tribal areas, customs, so that they can get legitimacy for themselves and fight against any developing forces in Afghanistan. You better know nowadays there are news and there are concerns from the Taliban leadership that some of the Taliban fighters, they are leaving the Taliban forces and joining Daesh. It is because they know that if they are not thinking about the parameters of legitimacy for their survival, their fighters and their militants will leave them. So that is because of the extension of the legitimacy, and that's because of the narratives and readings they have from the madrasas and from the textbooks, that especially the verbal curriculum that they are studying in those specific madrasas. That is the two main reasons behind the Taliban's policy of banning girls from education.
Okay, thank you very much. And so what would be the consequences of banning women and girls from going to school, university, and work?
I think that is more clear because when you pretend that half of the society remained at home and not active in the society, not getting education, what will be the consequence of that society? I believe in Afghanistan, we will have, I always say, unskilled, incompetent, and burdened girls generation who would not be responsible citizens for society building and market in today and future of Afghanistan. The dependency of women to men increase as what we are trying somehow to give an independent space for women to have free thinking and to live independently to raise up a responsible, competent family in the society. We will not have empowered families. No future citizen in Afghanistan will rise from such family where the women are not literate. The mothers, the women who are not literate are not capable to rise good citizen, responsible citizen, and any kind of needs that we have for the society and for the market. So consequently, we will face the greatest social crisis in our history. Besides, if you are banning currently girls not going to school, especially, you will have a total destruction of educational infrastructure in Afghanistan, a total collapse, because the schools, especially the girls' schools, the staffs which is working for that, the teachers who were recruited to teach or to deliver education for girls. So all these elements of education in Afghanistan will be collapsed. So that is why we will have short-term consequences and long-term consequences. The short-term is the collapse of educational infrastructure on girls. And the long-term is what I said is the greatest social crisis and also market crisis in the future of Afghanistan.
Given all these dire situations, Mr. Minister, how do you assess and find the international community's reaction to Taliban systematic discrimination, which is a clear example of gender apartheid?
Well, I have been always concerned on international communities' individual responses towards these issues in Afghanistan. I would say it's a fragmented individual responses and double standards sometimes, because the countries around the world, they have either idealistic approach or realistic approach towards Afghanistan. Those who have realistic approach, they believe that that is the ground reality in Afghanistan, that the traditional backward forces are gaining forces, gaining power in all across the country, and it needs time to be transformed and changed to a modern force and to deliver the rights of women, the rights of education for girls, even the fundamental rights for all citizens of Afghanistan. So that is why they are always looking for their leverages, their national interest parameters in Afghanistan, and they would think that what is their gain and what is their loss. According to that, they decide. But for those who are idealistically working on Afghanistan, they always try somehow to be optimists and work with Taliban so that there are certain consequences out of collaboration with the Taliban regime. But I would say that the Taliban regime, they are deceiving the idealistic approach of the countries who are concerned about education in Afghanistan. I have seen through different letters, through different news channels, through different sources, that the Taliban, they talk about the anti-girls education sentiment of the people in different localities in Afghanistan. They gave wrong estimations, wrong numbers. They gave wrong intentions from the people's greed for education in Afghanistan. They always say that the people of Afghanistan, they need time so that they are mentally prepared for girls' education in Afghanistan, which some of these countries are being deceived by these kind of narratives and reports from Afghanistan. That is why I'm concerned about the individual approach of these countries, and what they talk on media is totally different what they talk with the Taliban leadership, with the Taliban apparatus in or out of Afghanistan, and they talk about certain leverages, certain interests, and certain optimism. So,
okay, Mr. Minister, as you mentioned about
as a collective responses, they failed.
Okay. As you mentioned about the fragmented, double standard, individual and biased reaction of the international community toward all these discrimination of the Taliban regime inside Afghanistan. So what should be done? I mean, what is the responsibility of the United Nations, especially the European Union, the United States in such situations? Are they required to protect vulnerable people, especially women, or not?
Well, realistically and also ethically, that is a mandate, that is a responsibility, that's a collective responsibility for human security, human prosperity, because many of these countries and organizations you named are always talking about democratization of human beings, and also tackling any potential challenges and threats from the fundamentalism and terrorism across the globe. So you better know that in a society, when there is bad education, when there is ban on education, both will be resulted to a threat to the human security, not only to Afghanistan. We have seen enough threats, and we are enough vulnerable in our country. But that will not be limited and remain within the national boundaries of Afghanistan. So that is the potential and the practical consequence of the situation. That is why I also believe that's a responsibility, and that's a collective responsibility of all responsible countries and organizations to meet the expectations of vulnerable people in Afghanistan, especially women, for their rights, fundamental rights, especially on education. But what I told you is, unfortunately, the member countries of EU and United Nations, they have their own individual approaches. That is the problem. That is also understandable that many of these countries have reached a fatigue on Afghanistan long-term crisis. I would say half a century crisis, which is the longest crisis of the region that we have. They have contributed, and they were involved in Afghanistan to build Afghanistan for a reconciliation and prosperity, but all failed at the end of the day because of the irresponsible politics, national politics that we had inside Afghanistan. So that is what they do not reach a collective decision nowadays. They are having different mentalities and perception over Afghanistan's approach, how to deal with Afghanistan crisis. So that is why some of these countries, they believe that let's give space to Taliban so that they can be transformed to a modern forces and they can reach their goals. So what I say is always that's very miscalculation, but whatever they believe for these kind of arguments. So that is the problem, that they cannot give such kind of mandate and responsibility for the vulnerable groups in Afghanistan, which is the woman at first.
So it means that the world is still suffering from lack of an ethical mandate and collective responsibility in such dire humanitarian situations. Anyhow, what would be an ideal education reopening for women and girls? Your recommendation, please, under such situation. Do you think it's possible to have an ideal reopening education under the Taliban?
No, unfortunately, we cannot expect ideal education mechanisms for women in Afghanistan, because I'm concerned about education mechanisms in Afghanistan for boys and girls. But what we can do is kind of compensation, kind of responses to the needs of girls, especially in Afghanistan. That is why I encourage two methods always. One method is a quality elementary education for girls in Afghanistan. Since there is ban for high schools, for secondary education for girls, we should not make that excuse that there is no any way so that we can deliver the competent curriculum to the girls in Afghanistan. We have good experiences of our history in the past, that our education system, when there was a quality education, but limited, of course, many citizens from Afghanistan in that time, they were getting education until 6th standard, but that was a quality education. So we can at least do our best as an auxiliary bodies to strengthen the education standard up to elementary. That is one method that I encourage. And the other method that I encourage is a Sandy Hill education mechanism, which means all possible means that we have to deliver education for girls for the secondary and high school, we should not neglect it. For example, accelerated education, online education, community-based education, cluster education, traditional, formal, informal education, all means that we have to activate as much as we can give responses to the limited number, to different localities. That is what we can compensate the situation. Though none of these mechanisms can be replaced by a formal ideal education, but that is what we can do for now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Really great suggestions in such a hard situation, really. Dr. Mirwais Balkhi, former Minister of Education of Afghanistan, I appreciate your great talk today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much, Mr. Qasimi.
And I would like to thank our dear audience of Bakhtar Institute podcast for listening to us. See you next time.